Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, 1993. On paper, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday promised to be a surefire misfire. With that preposterous title, and a pedigree of 8 extremely variable films behind it, this sequel might be expected to go down in flames. And yet, due to a fortunate choice of director, humor, energy, and the returning guiding hand of original director Sean S. Cunningham as producer, it works surprisingly well. After Jason Takes Manhattan took a nosedive at the box office, Paramount offloaded their franchise into the hands of New Line. This was a fortuitous move, since Cunningham had a long-standing dream of joining his lead character in a titanic tussle with their Nightmare on Elm Street nemesis Freddy Krueger. Though this wouldn't bear fruit until 2003, it was a sufficiently exciting prospect to bring Cunningham back into the fray. Meanwhile, he reasoned, well, why not refresh his property to keep it in the public eye with another story? To that end, New Line agreed to Cunningham's risky selection of a very young director to put in charge of J. Hughley and Darren Laurie's script. Adam Marcus was a mere 23 years old, which arguably makes him the joint youngest Hollywood major studio feature director in history, aside from John Singleton with Boys in the Hood for Columbia in 1991. Even Orson Welles was just shy of his 26th birthday when his mighty Citizen Kane was released in 1941. Again, this could have augured badly for the resulting movie's fortunes, but it proved to be an inspired choice. Marcus's initial connection to Cunningham was that he was a best school friend of the latter's son Noel, who later studied at NYU Film School and sold a well-received screenplay to Disney that became My Boyfriend's Back in 1993. He campaigned hard for his mentor Cunningham to give him a movie to direct. When offered the next in the Friday the 13th series, his was an understandable reaction to what was now a poisoned cinematic chalice. "Oh no, come on Sean, I want a career," he recalled in Crystal Lake Memories. As a horror buff though, and with such a rare opportunity in his hands, he was smart enough to plow ahead with the very youthful zeal that would serve him well. In hindsight, Cunningham felt that Marcus's take on the material ultimately moved too far away from the original conception and formula. At the time, though, he gave his director the chance to break the chains that Marcus felt may well have inhibited any growth in the series. It certainly couldn't have hurt, as adhering to a more or less set template hadn't prevented a decline in the box office anyway. What did they have to lose? Marcus turned out to be a solid and well-liked director on set. Like John Carl Buechler, he maintained a fairly relaxed, light tone on set, except for a grievance over filmed nudity between himself and Carrie Keegan, as the final girl Jessica, who was reluctant to be naked for one of her scenes. This seemed the only time that his lack of maturity in years let him down, as he admitted in later years. That aside, Jason Goes to Hell is a refreshing boost to the run of films, which also aim to excavate more of the Voorhees mythology. A key benefit in this sequel is the higher standards on offer in actors and special effects. Almost all of the cast acquit themselves well, in particular the lovely Erin Gray as Jessica's mother Diana, who adds a natural grace even as a waitress. She is supported hilariously by the odd couple of Rusty Schwimmer as her foul-mouthed force of nature restaurant owner Joey B., who delighted Marcus, if not always her fellow cast, by improvising additional lines during takes, and Leslie Jordan as her pint-sized paramour Shelby. The male lead, Stephen Freeman, is well played by John D. LeMay, the only actor ever to cross over from the TV show to the movie franchise. He gave his role a gravitas that Marcus wasn't always at ease with, but respected. This pays off in his sparky scenes opposite the standout choice of veteran screen actor Stephen Williams, essaying the enigmatic serial killer bounty hunter Creighton Duke. Williams approached the role adamant that he wanted Duke to be something of a cowboy, attending his audition with a cowboy hat, boots, and a loaned Outback coat. He stuck to his guns, as it were, and the film is much the better for his defined, intrepid oddball. As with LeMay, Marcus came to trust and value the commitment he gave to the part. Watch the jailhouse sequence, where he will only give LeMay vital information in return for breaking his fingers. Such perverse behavior is oddly credible in a guy whose mindset is to single-mindedly pursue the most depraved hunters of humans. Speaking of perverse, there's the premise of having Jason's spirit transmitted orally via a ghastly slug after his post-mortem heart is consumed. A portable parasite is a little too reminiscent of Cronenberg's early body horror Shivers, which I covered earlier, and 1987's hugely enjoyable The Hidden. But this conceit, among others, allows the writers and Marcus's effects team, the famous KNB, Kurtzman, Nicotero, and Berger, to achieve some strikingly gross set pieces. Leaving aside the kinky face shaving of one victim by Richard Gant's coroner Patient Zero, the kills in Jason Goes to Hell are markedly more gory than in previous entries. Marcus realized that in the generation of sell-through VHS tapes, they could to some extent appease their frustrations about a purity of vision being compromised. They could release a tamer theatrical cut and then a more gory version for home viewers. The upward machete slicing of a female camper into two halves would never have been approved by the MPAA. There are nevertheless two real weaknesses in the film. Firstly, the narrative pipeline is clogged with too many ideas to be explored. The idea that only a Voorhees can kill a Voorhees, Jessica's baby, and her relationship with dubious mercenary TV host boyfriend Stephen Culp. The supernatural myth and resolution threads, etc., are so numerous that almost an hour of the movie had to be cut to simplify the plot. The running time was a strange bone of contention, and worth briefly mentioning as a sidebar owing to a very unusual producer decision. Cunningham ordered the film to be shot at 22 frames per second, like his Deep Star 6, due to his belief that actors perform too slowly. This resulted in an intended 90-minute movie only being 80 minutes in actuality, hence needing another 10 minutes. Between this and the aforementioned overrunning, it's a wonder the result is as coherent as it is. The other controversial flaw is that the story's preoccupation with science fiction trappings omit much of what fans love. The real Jason, a welcome third time behind the mask for Kane Hodder, being seen slaughtering his prey. We only see him in action in the bravura opening SWAT-style machine gunning entrapment and at the end, though at least he then becomes a much-awaited crowd-pleaser. Hodder was disappointed, but as a noted team player gamely went ahead and enjoyed the role as much as ever. And just to tantalize fans, the very end sees a familiar clawed hand clutch Jason's empty mask and drag it to hell. Did this mean we were to finally get the two great 80s horror icons together? The fans' verdict on release was a box office of $15.9 million. This would have been grim news under the old Paramount regime. Yet New Line were happy enough. Their aim was not to make a profitable second run for Friday the 13th, merely to bait audiences, while they awaited the teased Freddy vs. Jason. Unfortunately, while the finer points of creative control were still to be thrashed out for the next 9 years, the studio opted for another follow-on that most improbably of all would be out of this world, as we shall see. Stay tuned. Jason X, 2001. Jason X is a wildly improbable but enjoyable concept by director Jim Isaac and writer Todd Farmer. After pitching the still-involved executive producer Sean S. Cunningham his ideas placing Jason anywhere he could think of, the one that stuck was to project the homicidal hillbilly into outer space. Fortunately, New Line supported the idea enough to give Isaac a relatively huge $13 million budget, over 3 times the scale of any previous sequel, which allowed him to employ VFX firm Toybox to produce over 200 visual effects shots using green screen and CGI. It also benefits from a surprisingly rich and quite lovely score by long-term Friday the 13th company composer Harry Manfredini. The cast are of a high standard and play with spirit and a genre knowingness. Lisa Ryder relishes her role as kick-ass android KM-14 as just one of a number of elements inspired by James Cameron's 1986 sci-fi horror hybrid Aliens, along with the gung-ho marine grunts who are cold like the rest of the crew. David Cronenberg appears at the beginning as Dr. Wimmer, a favor asked by Isaac, having worked for him as a special effects supervisor on Existence in 1999. His is a nice genre cameo, inhabiting the horror movie archetype of cold fascination for the evil subject's potential overriding concerns for human safety that his own movies often featured in various clinics and facilities. One slightly grating aspect is that whilst Rowan, Lexa Doig, is accidentally freeze-dried into cryogenic suspension in our time, she awakes on a space vessel in the year 2455, where female crew members are dressed in the skimpiest sexualized outfits since 1960s TV shows like Star Trek. As attractive as they are, you can't help thinking, in space, no one can hear you objectifying women just like your ancestors. That aside, this sequel is sheer fun, if you accept it on its own terms. Kane Hodder still imbues Jason with a towering dexterous force in his fourth outing, and Farmer's script saves a crowd-pleasing transformation for him till the last act, where he is remodeled by the science lab's nanotechnology into a steroidally enhanced metal and leather-clad Uber Jason, before being blown out of the airlock and vaporized with Peter Menhas's Sergeant Brodsky. Lastly, the humor of Jason X is worth mentioning. After taunting Jason's ineffectiveness for his first literal stab at him, the Sarge suffers a penetrating slicing through his chest and gasps, "Yep, that ought to do it." My favorite one-liner, though, is the scientist who tells Rowan she's lucky that "you weren't alive during the Microsoft conflict. We were beating each other with our own severed limbs." No matter that Jason X only grossed $4 million more than its budget on release. Within 2 years, the long-awaited match between Jason and Freddy Krueger would finally take place. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.